Welcome to Voices from the Movement. This is a kind of a bi-weekly-ish speaker series hosted by Unlock Democracy Canada. I'm the creative director of Unlock Democracy. My name is Dave. We are a national nonprofit trying to reimagine what democracy looks like and leave democracy better than we found it. It's a lifetime goal for each of us. And this is the 5th installment of the Voices series. All the other ones are available on YouTube. Tonight's event is being recorded right now as we speak, and will also be on YouTube. Okay, so sometimes these things drag on for an hour and a half, or even two of them have gone for 2 hours. But Sabreena does have to leave at 8 o'clock. So we're just going to dive right in. Sometimes I get a little chatty at the beginning about what this is all about and why and who we are. I just want to dive in. Our guest today is Sabreena Delhon. And she is what is the title? Is it ED?
You just called me Sabreena Delhon.
Oh my God, I got my order. I guess you're the ED of Sabreena then. Okay, so.
Yeah, it's true.
Is it the ED?
Yeah.
Okay. Sabreena Delhon. I'm gonna have to download Final Cut Pro so I can edit this now. Sabreena is our guest tonight. She is the ED, almost celebrating her 1-year anniversary as the executive director, I believe, of Samara. So some of the folks watching tonight and later on YouTube might have no idea what Samara is. So let's just get that out of the way first. What is the Samara Center for Democracy?
Yeah. So Dave, it's so nice to be here and to be part of this program. So thanks so much for having me. And I joined the Samara Center in June. So getting up to the 1-year mark, but not quite there yet. So the Samara Center for Democracy is a nonpartisan charity that's committed to securing an accessible, inclusive, and responsive democratic culture in Canada. We've been studying the lived experience of elected officials for nearly 15 years, and we do a range of projects, research, and engagement work around making democracy relevant to different people. And what's top of mind for us these days, and for a long while, is getting a stronger understanding of how Indigenous laws, systems of governance, and ways of knowing have shaped what we now understand as democracy in Canada today.
Wow, that is amazing, which reminds me, we haven't done a land acknowledgement yet. I always have trouble with these because we're all in different places. Land acknowledgements were so simple when we were all in a room. I'm in Eugenia. I actually don't know a lot about the Indigenous history. Do you want to do a quick land acknowledgement from where you are?
Well, yeah, sure, I can do that. I want to make sure I get it right. So just give me 2 seconds.
Sure, yeah. So while you're doing that, I'm going to share my screen because I want to ask you a question about my favorite employee at Samara, which is actually a robot named Sam. There's the website sambot.ca, and one of the things I love about Samara is that they always put a lot of effort into the visual aesthetics of their work. You would think that a democracy group that has, primarily been the kind of a think tank writing reports would be producing really boring materials, and there's just always a lot of color and great visuals. And this campaign in particular, the Sambot, I just love. But why don't we do the land acknowledgement if you're ready?
Sure. So I'll share with everyone that I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And as I mentioned earlier, Samara is thinking about how Indigenous ways of knowing and systems of governance have shaped the way we approach democracy in Canada today. And we're mindful of that knowledge and understanding shaping how we move this work forward too.
Awesome, thank you. I'm going to share my screen again because I think you were actually pinned when I was doing it. So this is Sambot. So one of the things I love about Sambot is, again, just the gorgeous aesthetics and visuals of it, but also you guys measured something that is very difficult to measure, that, people wouldn't have thought you could easily produce data about this topic. Just tell us a little bit about that research project.
Yeah, sure. So in the lead up to the recent federal election, we were thinking about what we should do. What kind of project should a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization focused on democracy be doing in that moment? And we had been looking at how we can get involved in the democracy and technology space a little bit further. And we kind of landed on measuring the obvious. So actually, Dave, what we measured was super easy to measure and sad. And so I'll just give you an overview of that right now. So we thought, let's get into looking at online toxicity, because we know this intersection of democracy and technology is really at the heart of a lot of the problems we're facing in our democracy right now around misinformation, alienation. What can we do that could be interesting and significant and make it real to people? And we also wanted to respond to the fact that toxicity online is a major barrier to civic engagement. It affects who enters politics, who stays in politics, and it really takes a big toll on the electorate as well. It's a level of ugliness that turns most people away and makes them feel intimidated or indifferent, numb, bored. So we wanted to dig into that a little bit deeper. So what we did was we partnered with Areto Labs, which is a female-founded tech company based in Edmonton. And the founders had done related work with ParityBot. So I'm not sure if anybody remembers that Twitter account, but these are also women who had worked in political spaces, so they understood the online toxicity issue themselves and had developed technology to help mitigate that. So, so we partnered with Areto Labs, which we thought was a novel and important thing to do. It's not very common that a civil society organization will take a partner, like strike up a partnership, an equal partnership, not a sponsorship, with an entity that's in a different sector. And we really wanted the validity from a technical partner in this work. So we worked with Areto Labs to deploy a machine learning bot that tracked toxic tweets received by incumbent candidates in the election and political party leaders as well. And we called the project SAMBot because SAM stands for Samara Areto Monitor Bot. And I'm really glad, Dave, that you like the way we presented SAMBot. I just want to give a shout out to Elaine Stam, who's the graphic designer who did that work, because it was very intentional. It was very intentional to make something really ugly and intimidating, and also kind of actually difficult to grasp in terms of severity, engaging. How do we make it bright and compelling and bring some energy to it, not to downplay the seriousness of the problem, but to make it real to as many people as possible?
I love it. I can't help but think about gender dynamics when you talk about toxicity in politics. Many have suggested that it's one of the factors that might discourage women in general, but men too, of course, from participating, which segues into a question I wanted to ask you, which is, Samara is like really feminine heavy, which is another thing I've always loved about Samara. I think the democratic space, and I mean, to be honest, a lot of the nonprofit sector, especially at the highest levels of management and EDs, can be real male dominated, as we all know. And in this sector as well, you've got, well-known faces like Duff Conacher and Peter McLeod, people we've had on this series. Myself, I have a TED Talk and a book. Often it's male voices and faces that end up getting put up on pedestals and being offered leadership positions. Samara is not only seems to be constantly have a woman at the top, but most of the staff has also been majority, if not entirely, women. Is it intentional? what has your experience been in that space? What advice can you give to other groups who are floundering on this angle?
Well, it's interesting because I'm actually new to Samara and the community that it is active in. So I worked in the justice sector and in the academic sector for the last few years, and a lot of my work has focused on inequity in terms of cost, access, confusion. Why aren't people holding their public institutions to account more? How does power flow, and how can that foster more equity in our public? So when the opportunity came up to join Samara, I knew about Samara and had been keeping up with the organization's work for since it began, and had a lot of admiration for previous EDs. But the organization was looking to make a change. So it's funny that you see this continuity, and there is, I think, in terms of sensibility, but they wanted to find someone who could bring a different perspective on things. So certainly when we were doing Sambot, we got a ton of media attention, and having a executive director who looks like me and sounds like me saying, hey, guess what? Women got more toxicity than men on the digital campaign trail. I'm not surprised. If you're surprised, that's problematic. No one is surprised. This is measuring the obvious for over half of the population, you know?
Wow. Yes.
And, you know, just to give you an example, in one week of the 5 weeks that we tracked toxicity, and again, we were only measuring what was received by 300 accounts. So in 1 week, and also, I forgot to mention earlier, our bot could discern a microaggression from a threat or something profane. So there's some sentiment analysis there. But the true power is in the scale of what the bot could measure.
Right.
So 1 week in the election, in the campaign period, 4% of the tweets we tracked were sexually explicit. And that sounds like such a small number, but it translates into 20,000 tweets that 1 week alone, coming at a selection of 300 accounts. It's not like it's going to come evenly at all of them. Yeah. And we know that it's going to come at mostly women. So it's interesting for me to hear your observation of Samara being a feminist organization. That's my word, not yours. I'm comfortable using it. Because I think that does lend a level of credibility and authenticity and authority to what we're talking about, especially when we're also trying to demonstrate how something like online toxicity reverberates out. So if you're looking at communities that are underrepresented in a federal election or in other leadership spaces, you have to factor in things like online toxicity and why that would hold people back from coming forward, because it's not as if this toxicity is, you know, restricted in terms of availability. It's in our digital public square. Anyone can see it. So for organizations that are looking to have a diversity of perspectives at their leadership tables, they have to be responsive to that kind of reality, and they have to do some pursuing. Like you have to ask women multiple times, like there's a lot of research that shows this, to pursue certain roles of authority and leadership because they don't feel safe doing it, and they need to be assured that they'll have the supports and resources in place that they need to be successful. It's not a skills or competency thing that's holding them back. So yeah, that's I guess a very long-winded answer to your question, Dave.
No, thanks. I mean, in a way, it is a skills thing because it's the opposite. There's a skill of knowing how to put up boundaries and protect your mental health, and knowing how to stay out of an arena that's toxic. I think that's such important work. Before you were at Samara, you did a lot of research and advocacy around this area called access to justice, which is a term I wasn't even that aware of. But there's a whole scene. There's an access to justice space. Yeah. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that. When I think about justice, I just think about, or I think, yeah, I'll speak for myself. Like, what's there rather than who has access to it. So, and I compare that, I want to tie this back to democracy, because sometimes we measure democracy just by what systems are there rather than who has access to it. So I'm just wondering, let's do the law side first. What did that mean to you, access to justice? What is the problem, and what types of reforms were you pushing around that?
Yeah. So previously, I was working as a consultant in the access to justice space. I worked at the legal regulator for lawyers and paralegals, and I worked at a law school. And so that was my kind of conditioning, immersion, and introduction to the access to justice world. So it's very important to note that a lot of people don't know what that phrase means.
Yeah.
And it is a bit clunky and inaccessible. And a lot of the work that I did over the course of about a decade was about really ripping that apart, tearing into that to explain that that was very reflective of our justice culture, that even the term that's used to make the justice system more relevant and accessible to the public is in itself not a successful term for mobilizing because it's so exclusionary.
Okay.
And but just briefly to define, access to justice can mean any kind of justice system improvement to a form that's designed to be more easy to complete, to a process that makes it easier to handle a legal problem, to a sense of connection and trust to the institution of justice in our democracy. It is so broad. So that is problematic, because if you can't define a problem neatly and tidily, then how are you going to know that you're making any progress on it? And something that I would talk about a lot in that space was that we can draw from private sector spaces. We can take some of their tools and approaches and use them here. We can set some baseline metrics around what we're trying to measure. We can make it mandatory for lawyers and paralegals in Ontario to do training around access to justice, to increase their equity competency, to make them write in plain language, to get them to make their visuals for access to justice events to be colorful and interesting. Like my pet peeve was whenever a poster for an access to justice event was about engaging the public, and then the image would be like a white hand on a gavel. We don't even have gavels in Canada, I'm pretty sure. Or like the scales of justice, or like the justice is blind, like kind of passive woman kind of image,
Oh, no.
like so problematic. And
Right.
I worked hard in that space to make the conversation mean something to people, to make it normal. And the research shows that everyone at some point in their life is going to have some sort of legal problem. It's totally normal for that to happen. You might have a problem with your landlord or your employer. There might be some family law thing going on. But in Canada, we're kind of like, there's an aversion to that understanding. It feels like anything to do with the justice system is bad. You've done something wrong. There's a real American legal like crime drama lens that informs how people view and react to the justice system. And it's such a contrast to how people view healthcare in Canada. It's much more likely that you're going to have one of these boring legal problems than it is for you to end up in the emergency ward. This is in a non-pandemic context. So people have such a connection to healthcare, but they're just really alienated from the justice system. And so what I did in those previous roles was studies that measured trust in the justice system. Like before you make your perfect form about how to navigate a courthouse that is designed to be intimidating, why don't we just see where everyone is at in the first instance? And that was one of the first studies, I think it might have been the first study, that was not conducted by a lawyer. My training's in sociology. And it was about empirically measuring the public, not taking some random sample of a few people from a courthouse, not written from the perspective of a lawyer or a judge, It was just straight out like Ontarians, representative sample, let's do a poll. Do you trust the justice system? And the answer was no, like overwhelmingly no, across income, race, gender. And, that's the kind of study that it's very simple, again, like measuring the obvious. It should have blown up the whole discourse, right? Like, I'm not trying to like make it all about me, but that's, what are you all doing if this is where everyone is at?
Right.
Everyone needs to stop and reset. But the culture is so, it's very homogenous in terms of like lived experience, training, approaches to the problem, such a strong aversion to the public. That was what some key leaders in this space, that's how they responded to the results from that study. Like, well, what does the public know? Like that was kind of not writ large, but there were some key people who were like, cute study, but like, come on, it doesn't matter. And that experience and those parallels, I think, are very relevant to how we approach democracy as well, because the justice system is a foundational institution within our democracy. And so that's the lens and approach that I'm bringing to Samara now.
Wow, I love the comparison to the medical health sector, which I've never thought of. We all have access to well, it's increasingly hard. There's a lot of waiting lists. There's a consensus that we all should have access to a family doctor. But why don't we all have a family lawyer? Like all have, why do you have to apply for like legal aid and go through probably a stigma laden process to get legal aid? I was served a cease and desist order 3 years ago from Nick Huvalis, who thought that one of my Facebook posts was offensive to him. I essentially accused him and others of being an accomplice to murder after the shooting in the mosque, because they were spewing a lot of Islamophobic garbage. So I had Trump on there and Kelly Leach and Nick, and I had this poster being like, wanted for accomplice to murder. So he sends me this fancy legal thing saying you have to apologize and remove it. And luckily for me, I was able to spend a few $1,000s to hire a lawyer who responded in legal language, but essentially said, fuck you. But if I didn't have a lawyer, I would have apologized and taken it down. I've been really scared.
Yeah.
But we should all just have, everyone should be able to call their lawyer, their free family lawyer.
Yeah, I mean, health and justice are not perfectly comparable systems, but if we think about the public's perspective, you should be able to have someone who can give you some legal information in a way that is meaningful to you in the path that you take to live your life. So if you're going to the doctor, well, why isn't there someone who can give you some legal help?
Right.
As well, because if you have some sort, like there's a whole bunch of issues that are going to show up at the family doctor that are of relevance in a legal context too.
Right.
Another study that I did a couple of years ago was around public libraries and how they figured onto that map of where people go in their path to try to make some sense of a legal problem. And a side note that although most people have a legal problem at some point in their lives, very few do anything about it because they don't know. There's the cost issue, there's confusion, and then there's this perception of disengagement, but it's actually exclusion. And so we surveyed librarians in Ontario communities and found that they were the place people came when they got something official in the mail or something maybe scary on social media, and they just wanted someone they trusted to give them some guidance and direction on what to do next, and where am I supposed to go? And so that's really something our society needs to be more responsive to, because it relates to our sense of civic connection as well.
So let's bring this back to democracy, and I can think of a few parallels. One, when you mentioned that a courtroom can feel alienating or hostile, I feel like a lot of political spaces have that same vibe. Mm-hmm. Aside from the toxicity of the behavior of members of parliament, the emphasis on tradition and rigidity and ritual can also make anyone feel like kind of like an outsider, because it's a bit of a performance. There's a lot of theatrics. But more importantly, we often measure democratic health by just, is there a free vote? Is there three branches of government? Is there whatever? And as we know, access to those services is equally important. So sometimes barriers to voting, for example, can be very blatant, like the stuff that's going on in the US. But there's hundreds of other ways that people have trouble accessing democracy and decision making. What ideas from your background in terms of access to justice can you apply in a really general way to access to democracy? So in the same way that courtrooms should be open to everyone, how do we make our legislatures and all of our government programs equally open to ordinary people?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to note that legal professional culture, which is largely based on precedent, has shaped a lot of our political culture in Canada. So that's the dominant culture of like, these are the rules, this is the behavior, this is the decorum, and it's this way because we've always done it this way. And then this kind of hierarchy and kind of status element that makes some people feel really good when that stuff is in place. And in both instances, access to justice, access to democracy, it's about diversifying the problem solvers and also sharing the power amongst all those problem solvers too. We have access to a wealth of people in Canada. When I worked at a law school, it was incredible to me that there was an aversion to seeking out expertise at the very same campus. Like, no, this is the law school. We do it like this. We don't have, that kind of connection and permeability to the other disciplines. We might invite them here, but they're here as our guest. So there's not that collaborative spirit isn't there. And it's really hindering our ability to attract and retain the best and the brightest problem solvers, right? Because if someone is only invited to consult or as a guest, the conditions of that engagement are so restricted and there's no accountability, collaboration. There's just like a minimal amount of respect in the engagement as well. And then you just don't have that personal connection. And I think the pandemic has underscored how crucial it is that we feel connected to each other, to our communities, to the systems we're looking to for, governance and leadership. And it would be wonderful if we could get to a space where we are actively diversifying problem solvers, not just in terms of lived experience, but also disciplines as well. So we have all of that in hand, but there's a block in terms of the culture that prevents us from seeking that out in a way that actually makes a big difference.
I'm gonna ask you a tough one. I find it tough. Sometimes, so you and I were filming something last week about participatory budgeting. So participatory budgeting, for those who don't know, is a process where people can get involved with deciding how money is spent, government money in their own neighborhood, and you go through a series of town hall meetings and propose ideas. There's a lot of programs like that require a lot of time and effort to participate. And there's, what was her name? There's a ladder of participation. What was her name? Anyone know? Put it in the sketch. Oh.
Arnstein.
Thank you, Peter. Arnstein's ladder. And it goes through the different levels of engagement where the lowest is kind of like tokenistic communication, and then consultation, all the way up to the top where the citizens are actually in control. And some people would assume that advocates like you and I would advocate for that top rung, like the most engaged, comprehensive, authentic level of participation. But one criticism I've heard of that, which I really struggle with, is how much free time that requires. And what kind of demographic has that available free time? It's someone who can afford a babysitter or a nanny who isn't holding down 3 jobs to pay the rent and feed their kids. So at what point does access to decision-making actually harm inclusion? And how how do leaders like you and I, who are trying to increase democracy, find that balance between opening up spaces without making that openness an actual obstacle?
Mhm. Yeah, that is a hard question. Like that's the question of our time. I think part of the answer lies in shifting how much weight we put on things like voting and animating or illuminating all the different forms of civic engagement that exist and how they're all valid and legitimate and important, and how most people are already civically engaged. They're already doing it. Like,
Right.
are you on your kid's parent council? Do you volunteer for stuff sometimes? Did you help bring your neighbor groceries during the worst part of the pandemic? Are you still doing things like that? Do you donate to nonprofit organizations? Most people aren't able to identify those units of civic engagement because the discourse around democratic engagement hasn't identified them and validated them and helped people understand, like, you're already good. You're already doing a good job. And in the absence of that, people feel indifference or intimidation, or they feel stupid. And that's also something that holds them back from taking up more space as a civically engaged person. And that's by design. It's by design that things make you feel bored or intimidated or uncomfortable. If you ask people to talk about politics in any way, shape, or form, unless you're like really into it, you do it for a living, people don't feel good. It's a bad feeling. And we need to reset that feeling and rebalance how much weight we give to all these different units of civic engagement. But it also is about shifting the culture in our society so that we have time and space for that. It's not something that you do completely detached from the life that you live. If we look at voter turnout data in Canada, one of the main reasons people give for not voting is that life gets in the way. So we have to do a better job of integrating civic connection and activity into life. And I think for a lot of people, that's more of a psychological shift than anything else, but they need that cultural boost and drive for that to happen.
Personal question in terms of a tactical dilemma that many people face when it comes to advocacy. A lot of the work you do probably makes you angry, or at least a lot of the data you see, a lot of your research. And I'm sure there's times when you just want to like yell and swear at certain people and express a lot of rage. If we always bite our tongue, then we're just part of the problem. But if we never bite our tongue, then we're ostracized. And as a woman and as a woman of color, it's an even lower bar for being ostracized. I can get away with more than you can. How do you walk that line? How do you decide when to bite your tongue and when it's time to attack, or be authentically angry when it feels appropriate in the moment?
Yeah. Yeah, the anger is real, Dave. And I have a wonderful network of friends and colleagues that I've built over time that see me and what I want to do, and the kind of things that are important to me are validated and legitimized in this way. And the vocabulary to even describe all of that has evolved so much just in the last 5 years. So that's been amazing. But I'm a writer, and I take notes all the time. I'm always writing down little tidbits from like here, there, and wherever. And what helps me process those kinds of rage moments or experiences is through writing essays. And I had a friend say to me the other day, I was trying to like get her advice on like a strategic thing, like how do I get this thing past this group to get them to care about it in this way? And she said, you're so funny because you're so conditioned to like give people just enough information to like bring them along, because that's such a like nonprofit kind of organizing skill. And she said, but what people don't know is if they really want to know how you feel, they can, you've written about it. Like I've had essays on CBC Radio about my experiences of navigating white privilege in professional spaces. I just need a lot of time to process and refine it, and then it helps me let it go. So the writing is a really important part of that for me. I'm grateful for editors who help me refine and process even further. And that act of then just making it public, and it's not rage anymore by the time it's done. It's a reflection, and it's advanced my understanding of what's important to me, how I want to approach this kind of work, what kinds of conditions I want to do that work in, and how much control I have. Maybe there's more control than I realize that I'm not using. So there's that, but I also do like other normal things, like a lot of emotional eating and yoga and stuff like that. Like I drink a lot.
What was the first one? Emotional eating?
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, I'm a live to eat person, not an eat to live person.
When we talk about diversity and inclusion, I think we all agree that there's been at least a public awakening to some degree in the last few years in particular. And one concern is that the response to it can often be tokenistic. And we had two very prominent women, members of the Liberal Party, 3 years ago, and now 4 years ago, I don't know. Wow, time flies. Who left a Liberal cabinet, and their accusation essentially was, okay, Justin, you've gotten really good at the aesthetics of diversity and surrounding yourself with what a cabinet should look like, but you haven't gotten beyond the window dressing. Now, I don't know enough about all the things that happened behind the scene to address that situation, of course, but this is a trend that we're no doubt seeing all over the place, where we think that the answer to lack of inclusion is just to have the right faces at the table, which is totally different than making sure that all voices at the table are actually being heard and feel comfortable speaking. So how do we measure accurately our progress as a species of overcoming major power imbalances between genders, between ethnicities? How do we get beyond the, what the photograph looks like?
Well, I think in the last couple of years, we've seen a change in standards of accountability. So we just have very different mainstream expectations. I'm using we in the broadest sense possible, but mainstream expectations around diversity and inclusion have changed because of the efforts of community organizers who have made these concepts and this vocabulary, words like microaggression or white privilege. Academics and community organizers have played such a key role in helping this become a movement that breaks through into the mainstream. And there are separate movements. I'm just kind of using very crude language to just explain the shift. So it's kind of incredible to have this happen within my lifetime. So I'm raising mixed race kids. I'm still at the point where I'll point out people on TV or whatever that are Indian, and they're kind of like, yeah, okay, like it's not that big of a deal. Their sense of what's normal is so different than mine. And so you asked, how do we measure that shift? I think the measurement comes from that gut feeling. So a lot of people feel very uncomfortable. There's a lot of shame and weird, tough feelings around catching up, because the standards changed overnight for the people who haven't really been tuned into this very much and thought that they were doing all the right things. So we'll just focus on that group for now. And now I think it's about making it acceptable that everyone is growing and learning. Everyone is on their journey of learning and growing. If your intention is to be positive and learn and grow on this front, then that's great. And I think of experts in this area, an anti-oppression expert, Rania El-Mujamar, talks about how she rejects the notion of fragility in these kinds of conversations, because fragility implies that you're just going to break and then you're broken and that's it. And she thinks that we need to have a very conscious understanding that we are all capable of evolving and growing. And just as, individually, we can all grow and evolve, so can our democracy. Like when people talk about how democracy is fragile. No, it's just growing and learning. It's evolving right now, as we all are. It's hard sometimes, but that's just part of life. It's part of how we advance as a society.
Let me throw another tough, fun one at you. You and I again chatted a bit about this last week. The convoy. You and I promote civic engagement. That was a really, really big manifestation of civic engagement. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people who probably many had never participated in a protest like that. They went down to Parliament Hill to have their voices heard. So on the surface, you and I should have been celebrating. On the other hand, there were questions around who was funding them. Definitely questions around explicit racism within their ranks. And then questions of at what point does civil disobedience become so disruptive to a neighborhood that, it's no longer appropriate. And I've been part of civil disobedience protests my whole life. And the point is to create levels of uncomfort. I've tried to block things. I've tried to stop things. I've blocked vehicles. I've thrown tear gas back at police officers. I was surprised at the level to which my progressive community seemed to have a universal consensus that this had definitely crossed the line and needs to be shut down. Because part of me was like, they're just honking horns, and some of those flags have to go, and we should know where their funding is coming from. But hey, isn't this what Occupy did? Isn't this what we did in Quebec City 20 years ago during the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas? What was your response? Like, were you torn at all between like, hey, civic engagement, and oh my God, this is a nightmare?
Yeah, so we have been talking about that a lot as a team at Samara, and our research coordinator Vijay Kumar, he said something that I thought was really powerful, in that it really matters who's protesting. And
Yeah.
so, and the response to this convoy, it's so complicated. Everyone pulls a different thread, and there's a different dynamic and element to it. And it's really telling about the state of our democratic culture in Canada and how naive and earnest a lot of people are. So yeah, first, it matters who's protesting. So the police response in the early days leading up to this, if we watch the footage of that, it looks very different than other protests in Canada. And the pace and energy of the police, very different. We know there are a lot of children at the convoy in Ottawa as well. And we've also seen how child welfare, just the response in the name of child welfare when it's protests from people who are not white men.
Right, yes.
So, in a way that causes generational trauma and has a long colonial history in our country. So my observations from that, I haven't landed on where I'm at. It's complicated. There's a lot of different dimensions to it. It doesn't fit neatly on our political spectrum. I think it's another element coming out of the pandemic that is forcing our reckoning in Canada with who we are versus who we want to be, and how we are going to take a much more active role in that, emphasizing our shared values, emphasizing civic connection, because we have been largely quite complacent on that front. If we look at Samara's history, for instance, when it was co-founded 15 years ago, it took a long time for people to even understand what the point was. Like, democracy is okay. What are you guys doing? And now it's like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you're here. Like, what do you think of this? And there's just an urgency and a complexity that really needs our attention. And I think the response to the convoy, the attention it was able to get, when we know there have been other protests of similar size and intensity that weren't able to get that level of attention and engagement, tells us something important about access and privilege that we're not ready to come to terms with, but we have to come to terms with that now.
Yeah.
And I think it helps to underscore that we're also a young country. We're kind of maybe in our adolescence as a democracy right now, and we need to come through this and do this difficult work so that we can truly evolve and enter our next chapter as a democratic country.
I love it. And yeah, the media attention, you're right, it was really exaggerated. I mean, if you took away their trucks, there weren't actually a lot of people. They just took up so much space because of these damn trucks. And in terms of the police response, you're right. In Ottawa, you could see a different response than to how it would have been handled if it was I Don't Know More or BLM, but even more, the Windsor protest. And if BLM or I Don't Know More try to block an international border, it would be done in an hour max.
Yeah.
That one really blew my mind. It really exposed some racist practices within our law enforcement. We only have a few minutes left. Another tough one. Let's just do tough ones. And by the way, I'm pretty much just like, you're like my activist therapist here. I'm just asking you questions that I ask myself every day and struggle with. So you're helping me sort out some of my thoughts. Samara has mostly been a research-focused organization. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, it's also been about using research.
Yes.
To make change.
Yeah, I would say your conclusions about the research have been really strong, but Samara hasn't really made the leap into what I would call advocacy, in terms of saying, okay, we've identified this reform, and now we're going to really push for it and like organize people to make that change happen and like celebrate the politicians who are doing it. And I mean, part of that probably came from the fact that Samara was born during a period when the Canadian Revenue Agency was like really clamping down on any type of advocacy, even nonpartisan advocacy, and charities were getting their status revoked. And it's only been 3 or 4 years where there's space now for charities to do advocacy. So I guess I have a two-part question. Is Samara considering moving more into the like activist world? Because I think we've been the opposite. Unlocked Democracy has been like all activism and not as much research. And if you were to start pushing for 2 or 3 reforms, of all the reforms you've identified in your research, in your reports, what are the top 2 or 3 that you would actually push for and try and secure legislatively?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a new chapter for the organization, and we're in the period of completing our renewal. We're rebuilding our team, and we're also thinking about how we can be relevant in this period of accelerated democratic backsliding. And we have to, if we want to make a difference, and I really want us to, speak with a bold voice, and for us to actively look for ways to foster a rich culture of civic engagement in Canada, and actively look to hold political structures to account. And I mean that really broadly, from Parliament to political parties. So we're actually working through right now, what are those top changes that we would want to see? And I'll note that the other shift, so, like now civil society organizations have a lot more room for advocacy. Us being a nonpartisan organization, I think might have been in the past viewed as like a hindrance, but it's such an asset today because we can bring grief to everybody. This is about just what makes the best sense, and not about plotting it on a political spectrum. So obviously, we're really interested in addressing the online toxicity element as a key barrier to civic engagement in Canada. When we did the Sandbot study, we actually couldn't report on race and toxicity, because we discovered that there's no standardized collection of equity data of elected officials. So we use the Library of Parliament to get our gender information, binary, only male or female, so that's limited. And then we just kind of kept, it just kept unfolding. So we need standardized data collection on the equity front if we're going to track what's actually going on. And that can actually, then it's also a service. Other people can use that information to further their research as well. And I want to draw from other disciplines, epidemiology and other social science spaces, because the way they collect equity data is different. They're just so much farther along on that front. And largely to date, the kinds of spaces we're talking about have used a political science lens to do things. We can access all of the departments, we don't have to be limited to that one. We're going to be putting out a final report soon about what we found in Sambot. We collected 2 million tweets in those 5 weeks. And so we have some recommendations about what we'd like to see in terms of responses from political parties to ensure that their candidates have safe working conditions online, and what will they do to support them after they're elected as well. And that helps us get into the nominations process and what types of things do we need to iron out and make more transparent there. We're also really interested in looking at youth civic literacy as we're emerging from the pandemic, because the learning loss that's happened over the last couple of years is our civic loss. And I think it's really important for us to take a generational lens and get involved quite actively on the youth civic literacy front. So that could entail standardizing education or community-based responses that secure civic onboarding for young people and help them understand that they're connected to their communities and that they matter. And it's not just about voting. Voting's important, but there's all these other things that you can learn and do and grow to build your confidence as an active citizen. And inherent to that is changing the culture so that it's not all about being a young leader. When we do that, we inadvertently stream all of these wonderful contributors from our democracy so early in the game. Why? Then we don't recover. That's like our major loss. So that's another area that I would like us to be active in. And we're moving forward on that. I'm really keen, our whole team is really keen for us to partner with a lot of different organizations, because if we're going to make a difference, we can't just be singing our song over here. We have to do it in concert with a lot of different diverse partners who can help us fill those knowledge gaps that I mentioned earlier before, and help us feel like we're contributing to something and building momentum and not just building things from scratch all the time.
Okay, last question before you have to go. You use the term backsliding. I think there is a lot of tragic backsliding happening all around us. There's a lot of reasons to lose hope right now and to be demoralized. What gives you hope right now? Through your own work, through your team, through your research? Have you encountered anything recently that just made you feel like, yeah, we can do this. We're on the right track. There's a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, we're building a really thoughtful, sharp and kind team at Samara. So that makes me feel really good all the time. Like, it's really wonderful to be, it aligns with like spring and us starting to emerge from the pandemic. And these are, dark days, but we're connecting and we're really thinking carefully about where we want this organization to go. And we have big ambitions. But this is really kind of cheesy, but I have an 8-year-old and she told her teacher about Sambot. And it just was like the best thing that's ever happened to me. We got so much media attention and everyone wants to hear about the data, and that's all been really amazing. But it was cool to her that her mom did a robot project, and they talked about it on Pink Shirt Day, which is the day that's about anti-bullying, and all the kids wear a pink t-shirt on that day. So my daughter regularly asks me questions. She holds me to account like nobody's business, and her questions are really good. And So are her friends. And that helps make it real for me. And that helps me stay out of grown-up professional work headspace all the time, because often what she's asking about is related to everything we just discussed. She was learning how to read at the beginning of the pandemic and saw Black Lives Matter sign all over our neighborhood. And so that's one of the first things she read out loud to me. And then I had to explain to her what that meant. And so we're always like engaged in this conversation, and her questions are getting harder and her understanding is becoming more sophisticated. And it just forces me to just stay true to what actually matters and is meaningful. And that act of translating things for her is very inspiring. And I know that's kind of like a lame mom answer, but that's also like why I can't hang out after 8 o'clock, so that's all part of it for me.
Okay, just quickly, how can people, all the people watching here, how can they support Samara? How can they plug into your work and amplify the important work you're doing?
Yeah, well, you already shared, I think, the sambot.ca link. So everything from the Sambot project, I'm just going to pull up the link here real quick. Everything that I just talked about with Sambot, you can find more details here. And our website is here. And
and for those who are wondering what a Samara is, maybe tell them all.
Yes. So a Samara is a seed from a maple tree, and that's our name because from small things, big things can grow.
Love it.
Yeah.
I will send these links to everyone tomorrow. And Sabreena, I'll get in touch with you tomorrow. If you send me any other resources or links or reports or anything, I can send it out to everyone who RSVP'd. I'll let you go to your family time now. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us and all the amazing work you're doing, and can't wait to collaborate with you. Unlock Democracy Canada wants to partner with you and find areas of common interest and work together.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. So Dave, thanks for having me, and thank you everyone for listening to me. I really appreciate it, and I hope you'll check out all the Samara stuff.
Okay, thanks.
Bye, everyone.
For those who want to stay on for a minute or two, anyone want to have a chat? We've never done this before. These have always gone a little longer. If anyone wants to just it's like you're at a public event with a speaker, and then you go out for coffee afterwards and talk about it. What I'll do is let me end the recording. Oh, I don't want to end the meeting. Hold on. How do I end the recording? Oh, there we go.